Our story begins 2.5 years before the Hosnian Cataclysm. Poe Dameron and his squadron had just returned from a mission to raid Senator Eurodo Rokintor's ship, which was a successful operation. Once Poe and his team arrived back at the Resistance base on Dakar, Poe informed Leia about the information he had gathered about the First Order. They both assumed, so Leia called for a meeting with Admiral Akbar and the other leaders immediately. The Resistance Leadership Council began discussing on what they could do to stop the First Order. The problem was they only had a small army with 0 to none ground vehicles, limiting their ground capabilities further. Not to mention, they were only receiving a small stream of weapons, supplies, and ships from a few senators, limiting the resistance even further than that. And another issue was, even if the First Order was a small military force, the Resistance clearly didn't have the capabilities to fight them head-on, after Poe was attacked by a Resurgent-class Star Destroyer. Understanding this issue, Leia suggested that they need to find allies, even though she understood well that it was almost impossible, as they were a paramilitary force, non-official government. So Leia suggested that they should attempt to reopen the Makuta space docks. Other than that, Leia had kept a tracker on 2 small Harbor-class mobile space docks, Sanctum and Reserve, that were used in the days of the rebellion. But Leia kept a tracker in them, just in case they were ever needed, especially after the New Republic's fight against Thrawn. Other than that, other members mentioned that they should go to Bracca and see if there are any ship designs that they could find. And while they would do that, Akbar suggested that he should go to Mon Cala to convince the Mon Calamari to assist the Resistance in ship production. Leia loved all these ideas, but she still had one concern. How in the dang ferric were they going to be able to fund all this? It would especially be hard to gain assistance from the Mon Calamari if the Resistance couldn't pay them, or pay for their ships, or at least support them with actual ship production. However, it wasn't all doom and gloom, because Leia did have someone on her mind that could potentially help give them the funds to pay for these ships, and that was Lando Calrissian, as Leia did know he was on Pasaana. So, Leia, Poe, a small escort of X-Wings and Resistance troopers would depart to Pasaana, and a couple of Resistance spies with a small Resistance troop escort would go to Bracca to see if they could find perhaps Senators, or Lucrehulks, or maybe even Acclamators, or maybe some other ships. Now, obviously, these ships were going to do absolutely horrible against the Resurgent, but they needed to just build a fleet, because their best chance at defeating the First Order would have to probably be to overwhelm them somehow. How they would do that? No one knew, but they would find a way regardless. On Pasaana, Leia would find Lando pretty easily because of course he was willing to talk to her, so they met up. They caught up for a bit, and then they got down to business. And after hours of talking and discussing, Lando would agree to loan the Resistance with a budget of 70 billion credits. He was also granted to be one of the faces of the Resistance because he was influential and he loves the spotlight anyway. And towards the budget thing, it surprisingly didn't affect Lando, and it was surprising that he was able to give the Resistance any credits. But while he was a high-stakes gambler, he didn't always give away all of his credits. He had secret stashes just in case things got really bad, so then he could keep funding his gambling sprees, although this was before he started helping Luke find the Sith Wayfinder. However, these credits were in reserve elsewhere, so they would have to go to one of his secret hiding spots, which they would. While Leia, Poe, and their Resistance team were getting Lando to join them, the Bracca team, as they called themselves, went to Bracca, where they were temporarily able to turn on a Venator and a Lucrehulk to get their schematics, and then they fled the scene immediately before New Republic eyes or First Order eyes, or even just the Scrappers eyes, were looking in their direction. And surprisingly, they were also able to find a couple of X-Wings there as well, so they took those as well, although they would call for some assistance, just so the X-Wings could be taken back to the base on Dakar. And once both teams had completed their missions, they would both head to Dakar to refuel, and then Leia and Lando would head off to Mon Calamara, just to make sure that Akbar could seal the deal with Ekchar. With the help of Lando Calrissian, the Resistance would have a bit of an easier time convincing the Mon Calamaran king to support them. He also presented some credits that if the Mon Calamari build ships for the Resistance, they will pay for them. And to top it all off, Leia reminded Ekchar that Lichar fought hard for the Mon Calamarans' freedom, and how that taking no action was what led to the Mon Calamarans losing their planet to the Empire in the first place. Then the Resistance could keep the planet safe, unlike the Rebellion, and it would mean that the Mon Calamarans would prevent themselves from getting more scars. So, Ekchar ultimately agreed to support the Resistance, and he would give them some ships, as well as give giving him many Mon Calamari and Quarren crew to support in making MC series ships. After hearing the name Quarrens, Leia asked if they had any ship designs too. She had heard that Quarrens were excellent shipbuilders and had built many ships for the CIS during the Clone Wars. So No Suri, who was around the area and was representing the Quarrens, suggested that he still had some old CIS ship designs that he could produce for the Resistance, and Leia just loved that idea and thanked No Suri. After a brief stay in Mon Cala, Resistance left with their new MC series cruisers, as well as many Quarren and Mon Calamaran engineers. Although on the way back to Dakar, Leia had an interesting thought about the idea of CIS ships. They were pretty much easy to make, for the most part. They would mostly cost less than a Republic ship, and if you produced them in mass numbers, they were very effective. So Leia decided at that moment that she wanted to rebuild the CIS army. Not just the ships, but also the droids as well, as it would mean much less sentient casualties for the Resistance. All she needed to do was just build at least a smaller version of that, so that they could turn themselves from a paramilitary group to an actual military force, one that could potentially rival the First Order under the right conditions. So Leia decided that she needed to go into the galaxy and find as many droid factories as possible, ones that might still be around, and she needed to find other CIS ship designs, and perhaps find more old rebel bases so she could house this new military she was planning on building. And plus, with more rebel bases, they could hit the First Order at many angles. So the Mon Calamarans and Quarrens would be dropped off at the 3 space dock and would begin immediately building Repuissance, MC series star cruisers, some old rebel type ships that the Resistance had in their possession, and some of the newer ships that the Resistance had in their possession. And what I mean by that is the same design of those ships, for clarification. This would take them a few months, but by the end of the year, the space docks were fully repaired and fully functional, thanks to the handiwork of the Quarrens and Mon Calamari. Not to mention, many CIS ships and Mon Calamari ships were starting to be built as well. During the repairing phase of the space docks, Poe and BB-8 went around the galaxy to find droid factories. They did go to Geonosis, but they wouldn't use it because the New Republic, the First Order, just anyone would be aware of it. So all they did was download the designs from the factory just to see what they could kind of build. But once BB-8 and Poe got the designs, they would flee before the New Republic found out they were on the planet. They did know where they could find one droid factory, which was on Akiva, so they would go to Akiva, but Poe would bring a Resistance escort with him just to make sure they could actually take the factory, because it was always being held by criminals. So they would make sure they killed off all the criminals, and they would take over the factory themselves without the people above knowing. Now, to build the air vehicles for the Resistance, Leia was able to secure a deal with the cult on Charos 4, where the people there would build all kinds of starfighters for the Resistance out of their love for religiously doing so. They mainly liked to make vulture droids, but Leia was able to convince them to make other starfighters, interceptors, bombers, and gunships. This gave the cult a lot of variety, which the cult would come to appreciate. They also appreciate that the Resistance had some of their forces stay at Charos 4 to protect the planet. The biggest challenge for the Resistance, though, was the droid factory on Akiva was underground, but they would figure out how to load their newly made battle droids onto their newly made ships. They would do this through various covert tactics. The cost of their growing army wouldn't cost much at all, as they would only spend 57 to 58 out of 70 billion of their credit. And in 2.5 years, up to 34 ABY, they had a large droid army, powerful MC-80 star cruisers, a large fleet of Resistance ships and CIS ships, and all kinds of Resistance fighter craft. And that was only the naval air side of things. For the ground, they were able to make enough blasters to supply every trooper and every pilot in the Resistance army. This included the droids as well. They now had the numbers and some quality firepower to match certain elements of the First Order. Another thing to note is that during this time, the Resistance had established bases on Crate and Agent Kloss, allowing the Resistance to hit the First Order on 3 sides. It was now 34 ABY, 6 weeks before the Hosnian Cataclysm. So during the first week, the Resistance deployed Black Squadron, which consisted of 12 T-70 X-Wings led by Poe Dameron to save 3 New Republic pilots that were being attacked by Major Von Reg. Once the squadron jumped out of hyperspace, a fiery fight ensued against Von Reg, and thanks to the quick thinking of Kaz, he would temporarily disable Von Reg's TIE Interceptor, which he would be destroyed by the entire Black Squadron. And luckily, Black Squadron wouldn't take any losses. Now Von Reg's defeat would have a small effect on the First Order, as Von Reg was a top Special Forces pilot, and he was an effective escort for First Order Upsilon class command shuttles for the most part. Later that day, Kaz would board the Tantive 4 and would provide much valuable intel to the Resistance, as they figured out the First Order were going to use Castellon as their staging ground to take over the galaxy. Luckily for Kaz, the Resistance could afford to have full squadrons now because they had thousands of X-Wings to use thanks to their high budget, as well as just other starfighters in general as well. It also helps thanks to the resource supplies from the Mon Calamari and Quarren. who were getting highly paid from the Resistance credit. So now they could assist Kaz and the New Republic anytime whenever they needed to. 3 weeks before the Hosnian Cataclysm, Black Squadron with Kaz would travel to Theta Black Station in the unknown regions to investigate a signal that was emitting in the area. A newly made Nemoidian transport with 4 commando droids led by Iden Versio and Del Meeko joined Black Squadron so they could covertly investigate the station. Now, just to clear a few things up, the Resistance didn't have many commando droids, and Lando Calrissian was able to convince Iden and Del to join the Resistance, just like how he convinced them to join the Rebellion. Before the Battle of Jaku. As for Shiv and Jay, they would stay behind with the Corvus. Speaking of Shiv, he was happy and not happy to see Lando, but Lando was very happy to see his old buddy as well as Iden and Del. The Resistance would end up getting all of the information they needed from the station, but this was not without issue, but not without any complications, as the power to the terminal shut down, leading to the activation of the First Order sentry droid that was aboard the station. But the droid was killed quickly thanks to the sharpshooting skills of Del Meeko, who still had his skills after all this time. The First Order, however, would receive a distress signal from the sentry droid, and Phasma would join the demolition crew to investigate this signal on Theta Black Station without Major Von Reg. However, this would be a huge problem for Phasma because once again, things would not go well for the First Order, as when they arrived, Black Squadron, Kaz, and Poe Dameron had been hiding behind the asteroids the whole time, and they would activate the power to their engines once the First Order arrived, and they would easily intercept and destroy the Upsilon class command shuttle and its TIE fighter escorts before it can get to the station, killing Phasma and the demolition crew as well as the TIE fighter pilots. After that, the Resistance team would flee the station, and after a few hours, the station would be investigated by another First Order team who would report to General Hux, that Phasma had been killed with the rest of her escort. The First Order believed it could perhaps have been raiders who had found the station and intercepted Phasma's team, as maybe they assumed someone was coming. It seemed a bit odd, but it was a bit hard for them to believe that it was the New Republic or the Resistance, as the Resistance definitely didn't have these capabilities to be able to defeat Captain Phasma. Otherwise, the First Order still went on with destroying Theta Black Station, but after that, they just kept up with their operation on Castellon, trying to convince them to join the First Order, so they could set up their attack on the New Republic and Resistance. The Resistance would send Black Squadron, Red Squadron, and Blue Squadron, which consisted of X-Wings and A-Wings, to escort half a squadron of U-Wings to evacuate the Tenol people of Jaku, as Leia believed that the First Order were on their way to Jaku. She originally decided to send Poe Dameron to the planet after meeting with Kaz for another mission, but she ultimately decided that she with a large escort would go to Jaku. She and C-3PO would personally meet Lawson Tekka, as this was Leia's brother the Resistance was looking for. In her mind, she felt like she should be the one trying to find him, since they also had a big military. She would be heavily protected. On Jaku, Leia would warn the Tenul village that the First Order were coming for them, and after much convincing, the villagers and Lawson Tekka would still give Leia half the map, of course, but would also board the gunships with battle droids and Resistance troopers that the gunships brought with them. And a few hours later, they would drop them off at the Resistance's 4th opened base on Dantooine. And yes, they ultimately decided to set up Dantooine too. However, Leia wouldn't leave immediately, as she could sense a Force sensitive was on the planet, and she was worried that Snoke would find this Force sensitive before her if they left Jakku straight away. So Leia with the escort would end up making their way to an abandoned AT-AT walker where a young scavenger girl named Rey had just returned to. Rey, noticing strange individuals showing up at her home, would attempt to defend herself, but Leia used the Force to stop her and told all of her troopers to put their weapons down. Leia explained to Rey that she could sense that she had the Force within her and wanted to give her a chance to leave this place and she could become a Jedi. Rey was really excited about the fact that she actually could possibly have the Force, as she always felt there was something inside of her, but she just never knew what it was. Plus, she had heard many stories about the Jedi. But Rey couldn't leave, and she explained that to Leia because she was waiting for her parents to come back. And Leia sensed that something was up, so she asked how long have her parents been gone for. Rey explained that she counted 16 years. So Leia asked Rey if she thought that her parents were actually coming back, if they'd been gone for that long. And they both knew the answer. So with enough courage, Rey would end up admitting to herself that they weren't coming back. This was the moment she was truly affected by it, and Leia Leia, having a feeling this might happen, took some time to try and comfort Rey, which Rey really appreciated. Rey didn't know if she could actually trust these guys or not, but if it meant that she could leave this planet, then she was willing to go with them. And Leia seemed like a really kind person. And Leia seemed to be a Jedi, so perhaps it was better for her to go along the path of a Jedi. As just like Luke Skywalker on Tatooine, there was nothing left for her. There was nothing left here for her. So she would ultimately agree to join Leia and the Resistance, and as they were leaving, one of the X-Wing pilots noticed a YT-1300 freighter at Unkar Plutt's shop, so they went to investigate. They would attempt to try and buy the ship of Unkar, but he wouldn't sell it to them. And he also wanted to know what they were doing with his scavenger. Leia knew something was off, so Leia asked Rey if she wanted to be with him, which Rey, in a held-back kind of manner, said no. Leia could also sense a lot of fear and resentment from Rey, and she could also sense that Plutt was about to do something, so she pulled out her blaster and shot him. And then she would wait a few minutes and then shot the other two thugs, as she knew they were on their way. So she would use the Force to open up the gate, and she would go in, and they would check out the YT freighter, and they could officially confirm it was the Millennium Falcon. The only thing was that there was no Han or Chewie in it. Unfortunately, Leia wouldn't be able to find her husband and her old friend. As for the other people in the village, they would stay at a distance away from the Resistance, as they saw them as a bit of a threat. Leia would apologize to them, and they would go on with their usual business. Once they had the Millennium Falcon, with the rest of the escort, they would leave for Dakar. On Dakar, the Resistance would use the first half of the map, and then they would find the second half from R2-D2. After BB-8 told him, they had the first half of the map. So now the Resistance had found out that Luke Skywalker was hiding out on the planet of Ahch-To. So Leia would go to Ahch-To with R2-D2, C-3PO, and Rey to bring Luke into the Resistance. While Admiral Akbar was left in charge of the Navy, Poe Dameron was left in charge of the Air Force, and General Kaloon Emmet was in charge of the ground army, just while Leia was gone. And it was also just in case the First Order attacked the galaxy before Leia came back with Luke. The Cold War was coming to an end, and the Resistance had been given intel from Kaz, who would end up returning to Castellon, as his friends were there, and the planet was under a First Order threat, so he couldn't leave his friends to be subjugated by the First Order. Plus, he needed to convince them that the First Order were actually the bad guys as well. Besides that, Lando would be in charge of the Resistance overall while Leia was gone, so he could be seen as the face of the Resistance, and hopefully bring more people into their cause. While Lando was at the next Resistance meeting, he thought if the First Order were coming to Jaku to find Lawson Tekka, then they should set a trap and perhaps capture a First Order fleet, or at least one of their Star Destroyer looking ships, because if they could capture one, they could find out where they were being made, they could use them against the First Order, and they could figure out how to destroy the Star Destroyers if they needed to. Poe stepped in, suggesting that he could lure the First Order to Jaku, and then the Resistance could spring their trap. So the Resistance would send 2 MC-85 Star Cruisers, 3 Providence carriers, 30 Munificent and Nebulon frigates with them, as well as 20 CR-90 and Bunker Buster corvettes, just to make sure they could capture this First Order fleet. And these Resistance ships were filled to the brim with CIS and Resistance starfighters, as the Vulture droids would be a small shield that could give the X-Wings and A-Wings some time to pack a punch against the TIE fighters, not to mention the Tri-Droid fighters as well. Not too long after, Poe would leave in his T-70 X-Wing starfighter with BB-8, and they would pretend to accidentally leak information that Poe was traveling to Jaku to find the map to Luke Skywalker. Kylo Ren jumped onto this information, and Snoke would send Kylo Ren and General Hux to Jaku, taking their Resurgent-class Star Destroyer, the Finalizer, with them. When they arrived, there was no one there, or so they thought. Just as they had arrived, Poe, who was flying his X-Wing in the atmosphere, caught wind of the First Order's arrival. He immediately sent a message to the Resistance letting them know that the First Order had arrived, which just managed to get through before the First Order jammed communications. The First Order would send 4 troop transports down to the village to capture Lawson Tekka and find out where the map was. And once they landed, the troopers would begin running out immediately to fight the villagers. But the crazy thing to them was that they weren't fighting villagers. They were fighting an army of 200 B1 and B2 battle droids in villager robes disguised as villagers. So worth it, Poe thought. This would become an absolute nightmare for the stormtroopers once a second droid army that was stationed nearby the village arrived. But the AAT tanks came in and they were just blowing the stormtroopers high in the sky and destroyed their troop transport. Kylo Ren, not knowing of what was going on the ground, would fly down to assist in the battle, but he would be intercepted by tanks and Poe's X-Wing. And unfortunately for Kylo Ren, he would not make it to the ground as his shuttle would be shot down. However, Kylo would survive, but would be critically critically wounded as he didn't expect the attack. No one else on board of the shuttle, however, would survive, except for the Commander Pauldron stormtrooper on board. So the ground battle would conclude within the hour, due to the AAT tanks completely obliterating most of the First Order on the ground. A few of the tanks would be destroyed thanks to the flamethrowers that survived, but of the flame troopers survived the initial attack, but then they would all be killed, as they were all just too dangerous to be kept alive. Once the battle was finished, Kylo Ren would be captured as he would be stunned by battle droids nearby, since Kylo couldn't really do much since he was critically wounded due to his critical injuries. And luckily for the droids, his shuttle had actually crash landed near the village. Some stormtroopers would survive, and one of those being FN-2187, but otherwise the ground battle belonged to the Resistance. The droids would be ordered to start rebuilding whatever they could of the village, while they awaited further orders, which they would start rebuilding. Above the planet, General Hux was waiting for Kylo Ren and his troopers to return, but he was taking a long while, so he would attempt to contact Kylo, but would get no response. Hux suspected something was up, but he wouldn't be able to do much about it, as the finalizer scanners were picking up a large fleet jumping out of hyperspace. He would launch all TIE fighters immediately to try and quell this threat, but when the Resistance fleet arrived, they launched 1,500 starfighters, most of them being CIS. So the TIE fighters were meeting quite a challenge, but they would try and take out as many of them as possible. But just like I hinted at, this was very difficult, because within the swarm of starfighters, there were a couple hundred Resistance starfighters that were being committed to this battle. And those T-70 X-Wings packed quite a punch. When the CIS starfighters and Resistance starfighters started splitting, forcing the TIE fighters to split, try and take out as many CIS starfighters and as many Resistance starfighters as possible, and they were starting to get cut down. Hux attempted to escape, or at least try to contact the First Order for reinforcements, but his communications were being jammed by the Resistance that had brought communication jammers that they had acquired through covert means, thanks to Lando of course. Once the air battle was cleared, many CIS starfighters and some Resistance starfighters had been shut down by this point, but if the First Order thought that was over, it was only the beginning, because some CIS and Resistance starfighters had been attacking the Resurgent-class Star Destroyer. And not to mention, CIS Resistance bombers were being deployed to disable the engines temporarily. And when I say Resistance bombers, I mean Y-Wings, just for clarification, as they never ended up making any more MG-100 Star Fortresses. And with the amount of bombers and starfighters that were still in the Resistance's arsenal, they would disable most of the weapons, and would also disable the hyperdrive temporarily. Once the remaining starfighters were officially wiped out, HMP droid gunships began dropping in B-1 and B-2 battle droids from the carriers, which hid behind the other Resistance ships. The gunships would clear out the hangars and drop off the droids, with many of them getting cut down due to their exposure, and just because the First Order put up a good fight, the more they kept coming in, and because the First Order kept putting up a good fight. Thanks to the HMP gunships, the First Order troopers would not be able to hold off the droids, and they would start getting dropped into the finalizer, and they would start making their way through the hangars, which was actually pretty easy because all the stormtroopers in those hangars had been killed. But the First Order would put up fights across the ship, and eventually the droids would manage to cut enough of them down to get to the main bridge, as the droids did not stop coming since there were so many of them. Hux realized at this rate he couldn't evacuate, so he tried to shoot down some of the battle droids, but he would end up getting killed. With the main bridge taken, the rest of the ship would fall to the droids, as even in the engine room, they couldn't hold off the droids because there was just too many of them, and the finalizer would fall into Resistance hands officially. A couple hours later, the Resistance had managed to get the hyperdrive back online, as well as some engines that had been damaged, and it would be taken away to the Makuta space docks with an escort Resistance fleet, mainly CIS ships. And of course, this is once they understood how to operate Star Destroyer in order to make it to jump to hyperspace, which they did. Kylo Ren would be holed in one of the prisoner interrogation cells, hold Force sensitives, and plus he was too weak to fight back, thanks to his shuttle being shot down earlier in the night. As for the other prisoners, as there were a lot of members of the First Order who did surrender, some of them would be placed into the other holding cells. Now, towards losses, there were at least a couple hundred First Order personnel left, and while they took heavy losses, so did the Resistance, towards droid losses mostly, and they did lose a couple of ships. But since the bombers and fighters were swarming the finalizer, they were able to reduce the amount of naval ships they lost. And the air battle was pretty rough, the Resistance, as they did lose a lot of CIS starfighters. They didn't lose too many T-70 X-Wings, but that was thanks to the CIS starfighters. They did end up losing a lot of bombers, once again mostly CIS. And as for the ground, a good chunk of the droid army had been destroyed, with 98% of the stormtroopers being killed. After much interrogation across the finalizer, FN2187 would reveal to the Resistance that the First Order had made a weapon and he knew the location of it. He just explained that he wanted to get away from the First Order. So Poe would bring him to the meeting table on Argent Kloss, as the Resistance had meeting tables at every one of their locations. If the Stormtrooper told them everything he knew about the weapon, and they can confirm it to be valid, then the Resistance could keep him in a safe location. So FN2187 agreed to this notion. With FN2187's information, the Resistance found out that the First Order's weapon was stationed at Ilum. So they would send Tem and Wexley to recon the area, and they would find Starkiller Base, and find out that the planet was the weapon itself, as it had a large cannon in the middle of it that seemed like it could destroy multiple planets at once. So the Resistance would once again mount up for an attack. This time, however, they would send a fleet of starfighters and send all of their MG-100 star fortresses than they originally had before their big military build-up in 32 BBY. They would also bring some CIS ships so they could launch some CIS fighters too, and Poe would lead the assault with X-Wings, A-Wings, and Y-Wings to cut down the TIE fighters, as well as Vulture droids and Tri-droids. And once the battle began, it would be that way. The starfighters cut down the overwhelmed First Order TIE fighters and bombers, while some of the X-Wings and bombers would complete successful bombing runs in the trenches. And once that was done, the MG-100 star fortresses, protected by some starfighters, unloaded all of their bombs on the thermal oscillator, destabilizing the weapon and the planet, giving the cue to the Resistance that it was time to go. So all the Resistance starfighters and bombers escaped just in the nick of time, and Starkiller Base imploded on itself a few hours before it was meant to fire upon the Hosnian system. Snoke would learn about the weapon's destruction shortly after, and it was going to be nearly impossible for him to destroy the New Republic without the weapon. So he called back all of his forces, which some of them managed to retreat back into the unknown regions. However, when he attempted to contact Commander Pyre, Agent Tyranny, Commander Gideon Hask, General Hux, and Kylo Ren, he would be shocked to learn that he wouldn't get any responses from any of them, and he knew something had happened to them. He couldn't wrap his head around what had happened. It had to have been the New Republic or something, or perhaps it was the Resistance, but that didn't make sense. Now what happened was Hask was killed on Vardos by commando droids, and the Resurgent-class Star Destroyer above the planet would end up being under attack and it wouldn't be able to escape, and the Resistance would be able to capture the ship, as the Resistance had sent one of their fleets to assist Inferno Squad as their escort. As for Castellon, Pyre and Tyranny would be captured, with their Resurgent-class Star Destroyer being shot down, as the Resistance could have captured it, but it was probably better for them to shoot it down to inspire the people of Castellon to join the Resistance, and to show the people that the First Order can be defeated. They would, however, keep the Retribution and the Finalizer, but the people on Castellon didn't need to know that. After Castellon was liberated, Captain Emmanuel Doza agreed to supply the Resistance with the necessary fuel it needed. Doza would be paid for it still, and that wouldn't be a problem for the Resistance, as Lando had been out and about doing business deals with small shipping companies to gain credits to supply the Resistance. One of these companies so happened to be Han's shipping company, thanks to Maz Kanata helping Lando out by bringing Han and Chewie to Takodana. The Resistance would spend a week taking a break, refueling and maintaining any damaged ships, as well as their non-damaged ships. During that week, Kaz and Tammy would reconcile their past grievances with each other after Tammy found out that Kaz had lied to her, and they'll become friends again. Kaz would also become post-pilot apprentice, and the two of them would work perfectly together, and Kaz would learn so many new cool tricks from Poe. The crazy thing for the First Order was that they now knew the Resistance were located at the Elenium system after tracking Snap Wexley, but they couldn't do anything because the New Republic would find out about their military buildup and the military presence in the Outer Rim. After a week of relaxing, Poe, Kaz, and A Squadron would be sent Resistance fleets to investigate multiple locations in the unknown regions that were listed on the Finalizer and Retribution. And in the unknown regions, they would find multiple shipyards, factories, some laboratories, and just other facilities in the unknown regions, which they would all be destroyed except for one shipyard. And it would be a challenging fight in each area, with the Resistance taking huge losses. More on the CIS side, of course, but the Resistance were starting to lose some of their own ships too. And now most of the shipyards, all of the factories, and all of the laboratories and other facilities, they had just prevented the First First Order from adding more numbers to their army. Unfortunately for the Resistance, however, the First Order still had a mega-class Star Dreadnought, the Supremacy, which still could produce ships, but the problem for the First Order was that they had basically drained a significant chunk of their resources, and they were starting to be a bit dry in their resources. So the Resistance didn't really have many resources to work with after capturing the shipyard. But if they needed to transport resources to the shipyard through the Finalizer or the Retribution, they would. As for Snoke, he wasn't in any of the areas as he was too busy looking for allies or more ships to acquire so he could try and build up his fleet enough to take on the New Republic. Would it work? Maybe, maybe not, but he needed to just try anything. There was one more thing Snoke found, however. He found the planet Exagol, and he would meet Palpatine, but he would find out that he was nothing but an experiment created by Palpatine, which absolutely infuriated him. So Snoke would kill Palpatine where he stood, and he and his elite Praetorian guards who joined him would be forced to fight the Knights of Ren and the Sovereign Protectors who were in the area. The Final Order would attempt to activate their signal, but the First Order would catch them on it and would destroy it before it could transfer any navigational data to one of the Zeistons. The Zeiston-class Star Destroyers attempted to rise from the ground, but many of them would get shot down by the full power of the Supremacy and the Resurgent-class Star Destroyers. During their fight, the Resistance would arrive with all their fleets that they had sent to the unknown regions, as they had investigated the shipyard that they had spared, and they found out that the company responsible for these shipyards was the Kuat in Trial Engineering. And it was very interesting that it had the name Kuat on it. And they would manage to find their way to Exagol thanks to the help of Luke, Rey, Finn, who got discovered to be Force sensitive after Leia met him to thank him for giving them information about Starkiller base, and Ben Solo, who would end up turning to the light side after a long month of reconciliation with Luke Han, who would end up joining the Resistance officially, and his mother Leia. Now, just to make that make more sense, the Resistance had spent about a month finding all these shipyards and factories, and plus it was a bit of a campaign, so it did take them a while. The 4 Jedi would find the Sith Wayfinder on Mustafar and had wiped out the Alazmic of Winnist. It was a little challenging as it was 4 Jedi, 2 of them barely even knowing how to use the Force, but it was time for the Sith to end, so the Jedi would make that happen. And once they found the Sith Wayfinder, they would transmit the location and coordinates to the Resistance. And that's how the Resistance found their way to Exagol. When the Resistance arrived, they were lucky because the Supremacy was facing its back towards them, as well as the rest of the First Order fleet. So, the Resistance would prioritize taking the mega-class Dreadnought, which they would by sending in multiple HMP gunships and C-9799 landing craft, where hundreds of thousands of battle droids were constantly being sent in from the Lucrehulks, Munificents, Mon Calamari cruisers, and other Resistance and CIS type ships in order to capture the Dreadnought. While the battle droids were taking the hangars of the Supremacy, Admiral Pride would be killed by his stormtroopers as he refused to destroy the Zeiston-class Star Destroyers due to his loyalty for Palpatine. And he would kill a few of the officers and stormtroopers in the command bridge, but he would end up getting overwhelmed and would be killed where he stood. Once the Resistance had the ship, they would use it to tear down the entire First Order fleet, except for the Supremacy, of course. And with the rest of the Resistance fleet, they would wipe out what remained of the Final Order Star Destroyers, as the First Order had already done a lot of the work for them. As for the air battle, it would go very smoothly, as Kaz and Poe would lead the air assault, and would get some assistance from the Navy, led by Admiral Akbar, and they would easily cut down the First Order and Final Order TIE fighters, as they had already been cutting down each other. As for the ground battle, Resistance forces, both droid and sentient, as the Resistance were able to gain a few more recruits, would be sent to take the Citadel/Sith Temple, led by Luke Skywalker and his 3 new Padawans. Leia, however, would stay aboard the Raddus where Akbar was located. Once the Resistance forces managed to make it into the Citadel, Ben Solo would kill Snoke because he was too distracted using the Force to kill one of the Knights of Ren. And Luke let him do this because he knew that Ben needed this. After that, Luke and his ground forces would kill the remaining guards, both First Order and Final Order, and they would kill the Knights of Ren, which most of them had been killed by now. Once the battle was over, the Resistance forces, including the Jedi, would release a large, humongous cheer as they had not just secured a massive victory that could end the war, but they just wiped out the Sith. And shortly after that, they would all board their ships and use the Mega-class Dreadnought's remaining firepower to orbitally bombard the Temple of Exagol and the shipyard underneath the surface. And this would prevent Palpatine from ever returning. A few days later, Leia would present her evidence of the First Order's plan to attack the galaxy, as well as their military build-up to the New Republic. And she'd explained that she'd put an end to them, but there were still remnants out there. And the Senate were just appalled by this information. So the government would start a campaign to find any spies in their government, which they would, and they would round them all up and imprison them. They would also offer an alliance to the Resistance, which the Resistance were allowed to keep their fleet, but the New Republic would build their own just in case, as they were scared of the giant mobile fortress that was the Supremacy. So the Resistance accepted this deal, and they became allies officially. And during the next few years, they would take out criminal organizations and the remainder of the First Order remnants. And during this time, many citizens would go on to joining the Resistance and the New Republic. And once the First Order was completely destroyed, both factions would continue to expand and colonize in the unknown regions, which was actually made a lot easier thanks to the help of the Chiss Ascendancy, who would also, in a crazy twist of fate, end up becoming their ally too, as the Resistance and New Republic had shown them that they were clearly more helpful than the Empire ever could have been. Once that was done, Luke would have a temple built on the planet of Tython, with Ben Solo, who had fully rebuilt his relationship with his whole family at this point, with many members joining them, including Finn, Rey, and 50 Force sensitives who would learn to become Jedi. As for the Resistance, they and the rebuilt CIS army would be remembered for their bravery and for freeing the galaxy. And by this time, all four factions had become a part of a bigger alliance that became known as the Galactic Alliance. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our story. Before we get into the part where we talk about the story, I just wanted to give you guys a bit of a talk about the channel. Regarding that, at some point, when I can afford it, I plan to hire an editor so I can make more videos and actually get them out to you guys with the same, with better quality and better editing, in all honesty. So that's the plan with that. I think it'll just be easier if I have someone doing the editing for me. So that will happen at some point. I'm not sure when though. But besides that, let's talk about the story now, shall we? So, a bit happened. The first part, I kind of felt like there needed to be like a setup where they're going around looking for ships and allies. And I feel like in order for them to even think about rebuilding the CIS, they need to see them on Calamari and the Quarren. Because the Mon Calamari helped the rebellion. So I feel like Leia would try to get them to help the Resistance. Because she convinced them on Calamari once, kind of. But she could probably do it again. And I feel like the only way for a lot of this to work on the financial side of things is Lando Calrissian. I'd imagine he would have some credits left. Probably like a lot, like large stores that maybe he had just in case he ever lost a game of Sabacc or some other gambling game. It did say he was pretty wealthy, and I've done some research on him, and my research has said that, and a lot of the answers I've gotten were that he was wealthy, not the most wealthiest person in the galaxy, but definitely a pretty wealthy person, and he usually did high-stakes gambling, where he'll just gamble a lot of stuff. That's actually how he lost. Apparently, that's how he lost Cloud City. But I just wanted to make sure. But I felt like he would have a lot of credits still in reserve, because usually with gambling, I feel like a gambler like him would be smart in the sense of continuing to gamble, if that makes sense. So obviously not smart enough not to stop obviously not smart enough to stop gambling, but smart enough to keep some reserves for when he wants to gamble again, just in case he got on a constant losing streak. And besides that, I feel like, now I know this is another Resistance video where it's set before the main events, but I feel like that's the best way this can work, because otherwise it's kind of hard at the First Order just know where they are, and if they just go and blow it up. So I feel like the Resistance kind of have to jump from place to place to kind of give a sense of urgency. That's kind of what I felt like this story was really. I feel like that was the best way to kind of tell this particular story. And then the Battle of Jaku is where, like, things get crazy and big. Obviously not to the same extent as the Battle of Exagol, but, like, they're just jumping out of nowhere. The Resistance just jump out of nowhere with this large fleet, taking the First Order Star Destroyer. Because I feel like if they have a fleet that's so big with a large droid army, I feel like that's what they would do. Especially if they want to show the New Republic their evidence and actually have some victories against the First Order, rather than trying to destroy the Resurgent class Star Destroyer. And then come to the Battle of Exagol. Obviously, the idea of Snoke and Palpatine having a civil war and fighting it out has already been explored a few times. So I wanted to kind of twist that formula a little. I wanted to kind of twist that a little bit and add in the Resistance. So it's like a little bit of a three-way war. But and the last part of the story where I have them become a part of the have them form the Galactic Alliance. I'm obviously aware the Chiss Ascendancy aren't a part of that, but I thought it would just kind of be cool to add that in at the end. But anyways, hope you guys enjoyed the story. You guys are awesome, and I'll see you guys next time on The Alternate Star Wars Galaxy.